My mother always considered my brother smart. She said, "He was always so smart. He became an accountant, and that's why she left him the money for the house, but I was truly shocked when I found out what he was hiding. You know how some families have that one kid who can do no wrong? In our house, that was my older brother Evan. While I was fixing broken phones and laptops at a local repair shop, making barely enough to cover rent on my studio apartment, Evan was wearing suits and talking about tax codes like they were bedtime stories. Mom passed away when she was 67, and honestly, I wasn't surprised when everything seemed to flow straight to Evan like water finding the lowest point. The house, her car, even her jewelry box. Everything had his name written all over it before the funeral flowers had even wilted. I remember standing in that funeral home, watching relatives shake Evan's hand and tell him how responsible he was, how much Mom trusted him with the important stuff. Meanwhile, I got the sympathetic head tilts and the whole, "at least you're doing okay" routine. You know the type, the kind of pity that makes your skin crawl because deep down, you're starting to believe maybe they're right. The thing about being a family screw-up is that after a while, you start accepting it as gospel truth. Mom would call Evan every Sunday to discuss her finances, her medications, her plans for the future. She called me maybe once a month to ask if I was eating enough vegetables and whether I'd found a girlfriend yet. The message was pretty clear. One son was capable of handling real adult stuff, and the other son was just trying not to mess up too badly. After the funeral, I went to clean out Mom's bedroom. That's when Aunt Rhonda cornered me in the hallway, arms crossed like she was guarding Fort Knox. She basically told me to leave everything to Evan because he understood the paperwork and the legal stuff. She said I hadn't done much while Mom was alive anyway. So why start now? The way she said it, you'd think I'd been living on another planet instead of just across town. But here's the thing about grief. It makes you stubborn in weird ways. I wasn't about to let them erase me completely from Mom's life story. So I took the small cardboard box of her personal items that nobody else seemed to want. Photos, some old letters, a few pieces of costume jewelry that probably came from the grocery store checkout line. Back at my apartment, I spread everything out on my kitchen table like I was conducting some kind of investigation. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Birthday cards I'd made in elementary school, pictures of family vacations where everyone looked slightly annoyed to be there, and a bunch of receipts for things that didn't matter anymore. Then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. Hidden inside an old Christmas card envelope was a small brass key with a number scratched into it. Attached to the key was a folded piece of paper with Mom's handwriting. First National Bank, downtown L.A., Box 847. If something happens to me, you need to go there. There's stuff I never got to tell you. I stared at that note for probably 20 minutes, reading it over and over like the words might change if I looked at them differently. Mom had a safety deposit box. She'd never mentioned it to anyone, not even to Evan during all those Sunday financial planning calls. This felt like finding a secret door in a house you'd lived in your whole life. The bank was a 40-minute drive through L.A. traffic, which gave me plenty of time to imagine what might be in that box. Maybe it was nothing, old insurance papers or some jewelry she'd forgotten about. But something in my gut told me this was bigger than forgotten trinkets. The bank manager, a woman who looked like she'd been dealing with grieving relatives for about 30 years, walked me down the vault after I showed her Mom's death certificate and the key. She explained that Mom had been paying for this box for over 15 years, always in cash, always on time. When I opened that metal box, I felt like I was looking into a parallel universe. Inside were manila folders, each one labeled in Mom's careful handwriting with dates going back to 2008. Bank statements, savings account records, certificates of deposit, all showing amounts that made my eyes water. We're talking about serious money here, the kind that could change everything. But what really knocked me sideways was a folder labeled Aaron's House Fund. Inside were copies of withdrawal slips, bank transfers, and handwritten notes documenting how Mom had been secretly setting aside money for years. The final entry, dated just 3 months before she passed, showed a withdrawal of $160,000 with a note that said, "Given to Evan for Aaron's house purchase. He promised to handle the paperwork, since I'm not good with legal stuff anymore." My hands were literally shaking as I read through page after page of evidence that Mom had been planning to buy me a house. not just thinking about it or hoping to maybe someday help out. She'd actually done it. She'd saved the money, made the arrangements, and trusted Evan to make it happen. I pulled out my phone and started Googling property records for our area. It took about 10 minutes to find what I was looking for. 3 months ago, right around the time of Mom's final bank withdrawal, a house had been purchased on Maple Street. The buyer's name on the deed? Evan Mitchell Morrison. The address was familiar. I'd driven past a dozen times over the years. It was a nice little 2-bedroom place with a front yard and everything. The kind of house where you could actually invite people over without being embarrassed about the paper-thin walls and the neighbors' music bleeding through at all hours. I sat in my car outside that house for probably an hour, just staring at it and trying to process what I'd learned. There was Evan's car in the driveway, along with a red Honda I didn't recognize. Through the front window, I could see him moving around inside, probably making dinner or watching TV like he owned the place. Because technically he did own it, with money that was supposed to buy it for me. The worst part wasn't even the money, though that hurt plenty. It was realizing that Mom had seen something in me worth investing in, worth planning for, worth sacrificing for. She believed I could handle having a real home, a place to build something stable. And Evan had taken that belief and twisted it into just another way to prove he was the responsible one. I finally worked up the courage to knock on the door. When Evan answered, he had this look on his face like he'd been expecting me to show up eventually. Behind him, I could hear a woman's voice asking who was at the door. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, probably to keep his girlfriend from hearing whatever conversation we were about to have. For a minute, we just stood there looking at each other. He seemed bigger somehow, more solid, like owning property had added actual weight to his presence. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be some simple misunderstanding that we could clear up with a heart-to-heart conversation. This was going to be a fight, and I was going to have to decide whether I was strong enough to have it. Standing on that porch, looking at my brother's smug face, I felt like I was about to jump off a cliff without knowing if there was water at the bottom. But sometimes you reach a point where staying put feels more dangerous than taking the leap. I pulled out the folder from Mom's safety deposit box and watched Evan's expression change from annoyed confusion to something that looked like genuine panic. His eyes darted to the papers in my hands, then back to my face, like he was trying to calculate how much trouble he was actually in. The conversation that followed wasn't pretty. Evan went through about 5 different explanations in the span of 10 minutes, each one more creative than the last. First, he claimed Mom had changed her mind about giving me the money. Then he said she'd asked him to invest it instead of buying a house. Finally, he settled on the story that she wanted him to find me a place but hadn't been specific about the timeline. What really got to me was how smooth he was about the whole thing. This wasn't some panic confession from a guy who'd made a mistake. This was a performance from someone who'd been preparing for this conversation since the day he cashed Mom's check. He had answers ready for everything, complete with fake concern about my financial responsibility and my ability to handle homeownership. According to Evan, Mom had been worried that I'd mess up the mortgage payments or let the house fall apart. She'd supposedly asked him to hold on to the property until I proved I could handle the responsibility. Of course, there was no timeline for when I might prove myself worthy, and no written agreement about any of this arrangement. The woman inside kept calling his name, and eventually she came to the door. This was Samantha, apparently, a blonde woman in her 30s who looked at me like I was there to repossess the furniture. Evan introduced me as his little brother who was going through a rough patch, which was rich coming from the guy who'd stolen my inheritance. I drove home feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, not just because of the money, though that hurt plenty, but because of how easily Evan had made me feel small again. Even with evidence in my hands, even knowing I was right, he'd managed to make me walk away feeling like maybe I was the one being unreasonable. That night, I called my cousin Jenny, partly because I needed to talk to someone and partly because I wanted to test the waters with the rest of the family. Jenny had always been more neutral in family politics, less likely to automatically take Evan's side just because he wore ties to work. Her reaction was about what I expected. She was sympathetic but cautious, saying things like how complicated family money situations could be and how maybe there was more to the story than I understood. She did mention that Evan had been talking about his new house for months, bragging about the great deal he'd gotten and how smart he'd been with his investments. The next morning, I decided to do something I probably should have done years ago. I stopped accepting other people's versions of who I was supposed to be. I took a personal day from work and drove to the county recorder's office to get copies of all the documents related to the house purchase. The clerk, a tired-looking guy who probably dealt with family drama on a daily basis, helped me navigate the system. Within an hour, I had copies of the deed, the purchase agreement, and all the financial records associated with the sale. Everything was in Evan's name, just like I'd expected. But the timing lined up perfectly with Mom's withdrawal. I also requested records for any other properties Evan might have purchased in the last few years. That's when things got really interesting. Turns out my responsible, financially savvy brother had been living in a rental apartment until 3 months ago. The house on Maple Street wasn't an investment property or a smart financial move. It was the first place he'd ever owned. Armed with this information, I made another trip to the bank where Mom had kept her safety deposit box. I explained the situation to the same manager who'd helped me before, and she agreed to pull the records for Mom's account activity over the past year. What I found made my blood boil. Mom hadn't just withdrawn $160,000 for the house. Over the course of 6 months, she made several smaller withdrawals totaling another $40,000. The memo lines on these transactions were heartbreaking. Aaron's furniture, Aaron's moving expenses, Aaron's emergency fund. She'd been planning every detail of setting me up in my own place. She thought about furniture, about helping me with the transition, about making sure I had a cushion in case something went wrong. This wasn't just about buying me a house. It was about giving me a complete fresh start. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at those transaction records and feeling angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Not just at Evan, but at myself for believing all these years that Mom saw me as the family failure. She'd been quietly planning my future, while I was convinced she thought I was hopeless. The really twisted part was that Evan had probably figured this out before I did. He'd known exactly how much Mom believed in me, and he decided that belief was wasted on someone like me. In his mind, he was probably doing everyone a favor by keeping the money in more capable hands. I called the bank and asked them to print out every transaction record they had for Mom's accounts going back 2 years. If I was going to confront Evan again, I wanted to have everything documented. No more letting him talk his way out of accountability. While I was waiting for the bank to prepare the records, I decided to drive past the house again. This time, I parked across the street and really looked at the place. It was exactly the kind of home Mom would have picked for me. Not too big, not too fancy, but solid and respectable. The kind of place where you could have friends over for barbecues and feel proud of what you'd built. There was a small garden in the front yard, and I could see that someone had been taking care of it. Probably Samantha, based on the decorative touches that definitely weren't Evan's style. It occurred to me that she might not even know the real story behind how they'd acquired the house. For all she knew, Evan had saved up and bought it legitimately. A neighbor came out to get his mail and waved at me like I belonged there. I waved back automatically, then realized that in another timeline, the one where Evan had actually done what Mom asked, this would have been my neighbor. These would have been my streets to walk, my local coffee shop to visit, my community to be part of. By the time I got home, I'd made a decision that scared me more than anything I'd ever contemplated. I was going to hire a lawyer and take Evan to court. Not because I thought it would be easy or because I was confident about winning, but because Mom had believed I was worth fighting for, and it was time I started believing it too. I spent the evening researching attorneys who handle family disputes and estate issues. Most of them had websites full of serious-looking people in expensive suits, which made me wonder if I was crazy for thinking someone like me could afford to challenge someone like Evan in court. But then I found a small firm that specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Cases where family members had misused funds intended for someone else. The initial consultation was free, and a lawyer I spoke with, a woman named Patricia Martinez, sounded genuinely interested when I explained what happened. Patricia asked me to bring all my documentation to her office the following week. She warned me that family legal disputes could get ugly fast, especially when significant money was involved. She also mentioned that proving intent could be tricky, since Evan could argue that he'd been planning to fulfill Mom's wishes eventually. That night, I organized all the papers I collected into a proper file: bank records, property documents, Mom's handwritten notes. Everything that proved the money had been intended for a specific purpose that Evan hadn't fulfilled. Looking at it all spread out on my kitchen table, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope mixed with determination. I was finally ready to fight for what Mom had wanted me to have. Not just the house or the money, but the respect and recognition that I was worth investing in. Evan had underestimated how much those safety deposit box documents would mean to me, and now he was about to find out exactly what his little brother was capable of when pushed too far. Meeting with Patricia Martinez felt like stepping into a world where my problems actually mattered to someone. Her office was small but professional, with law books lining the walls and a coffee machine that looked like it had seen better days. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished explaining everything and showed her the documents, Patricia leaned back in her chair and gave me a look I couldn't quite read. She said cases like mine were more common than people realized, but they were also notoriously difficult to win. Family members often closed ranks when money was involved, and proving someone's true intentions after they pass away required more than just bank records. Still, she thought I had a legitimate case. The documentation was solid, especially Mom's handwritten notes about the purpose of the money. Patricia explained that we'd be arguing Evan had committed what's called conversion, essentially using someone else's money for purposes they hadn't authorized. The retainer fee was more than I'd expected, but Patricia offered to work on a partial contingency basis. If we won, she'd take a percentage of whatever I recovered. If we lost, I'd still owe her for the hours she'd put in, but not the full amount. It felt like a gamble, but then again, so did letting Evan keep what Mom had intended for me. Word about the lawsuit spread through our family faster than gossip at church social. Within a week of filing the papers, I started getting phone calls that ranged from concerned to downright hostile. Aunt Rhonda was the first way in, calling me at work to express her disappointment in my decision to air family business in court. According to Rhonda, I was being selfish and ungrateful. Evan had always been the responsible one, the one who'd helped Mom with her finances and her medical appointments. If she'd trusted him with her money, there must have been a good reason. Maybe, Rhonda suggested, Mom had realized I wasn't ready for the responsibility of home ownership and had asked Evan to hold on to the funds. My Uncle Frank took a different approach, calling me up with what he probably thought was sage advice about how lawsuits could tear families apart forever. He'd seen it happen before, he said, and the lawyers were the only ones who ever really won. Why couldn't I just talk to Evan man to man and work something out privately? The thing that frustrated me most about these conversations was how everyone seemed to assume I was the one being unreasonable. Nobody questioned whether Evan might have done something wrong. Nobody asked to see the evidence I'd found in Mom's safety deposit box. They'd already decided the story based on their pre-existing beliefs about who was trustworthy and who wasn't. Cousin Jenny, who'd been sympathetic during our first conversation, started avoiding my calls. When I finally reached her, she sounded uncomfortable and distant. She mentioned that Evan had been talking to family members, explaining his side of the situation. According to him, I was having some kind of breakdown over Mom's death and had convinced myself of things that weren't true. The worst conversation was with my Uncle Dave, Mom's younger brother, who'd always been my favorite relative growing up. Dave had been there when I graduated high school, when I got my first real job, during the few moments of my life when I felt genuinely proud of something I'd accomplished. But even Dave seemed to have bought into Evan's version of events. He told me he understood I was grieving, but that didn't give me the right to destroy Evan's life over what might have been a misunderstanding. Evan had worked hard for everything he had, Dave said, and it wasn't fair to drag him through court because I felt entitled to something. That word, entitled, hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone I'd trusted and respected, someone who'd known me my whole life, and he was looking at my situation and seeing entitlement instead of theft. I tried to explain about the safety deposit box, about Mom's written intentions, but Dave had already made up his mind. The isolation was almost worse than losing the money would have been. I'd grown up in this family, share holidays and birthdays and graduations with these people, and now they were all looking at me like I'd become some kind of stranger. Even the relatives who didn't call directly made their positions clear through their silence. Evan, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving under the attention. According to Jenny, he'd been going to family gatherings and playing the role of the wrong brother, forced to defend himself against baseless accusations. He talked about how hard it was to deal with my lawsuit while he was still grieving Mom's death, how disappointed she would have been to see her sons fighting. I found myself wondering if maybe everyone else was right and I was losing my mind. Late at night, I'd pull out Mom's papers and read through them again, looking for some sign that I'd misunderstood something crucial. But the evidence was clear, and her intentions were spelled out in her own handwriting. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late spring. Patricia had warned me that this would mainly be procedural, establishing the basic facts of the case and setting a timeline for discovery. Evan would be there with his lawyer, a sharp-looking woman from one of the big downtown firms who probably charged more per hour than I made in a week. I took the day off work and put on the only suit I owned, a navy blue number I'd bought for job interviews that never seemed to go anywhere. Walking into that courthouse felt surreal, like I was playing dress-up as someone who belonged in places where important decisions got made. Evan was already there when I arrived, sitting with his attorney and looking every inch the responsible professional. He nodded at me when our eyes met. Not unfriendly exactly, but with the kind of distance you'd show to someone you used to know well, but had grown apart from over the years. The hearing itself was brief and formal, mostly consisting of lawyers talking to the judge in language that sounded like a foreign dialect. Evan's attorney argued that the case was frivolous, based on my misinterpretation of routine family financial arrangements. Patricia countered that we had clear documentation of specific instructions that hadn't been followed. Judge Williams, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, listened to both sides and scheduled a full hearing for 2 months later. She ordered both parties to produce all relevant financial documents and warned us that family disputes in her courtroom would be handled with the same seriousness as any other legal matter. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. The case was moving forward, which meant Patricia thought we had a real chance. But it also meant months of legal proceedings, mounting attorney fees, and continued family warfare. That evening, Evan called me for the first time since I'd served him with papers. His voice was calm, almost friendly, like he was calling to chat about the weather. He said he'd been thinking about our situation and wondered if we could meet somewhere neutral to discuss a settlement. The suggestion felt like a trap, but I was curious enough to hear what he had to say. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where business people had serious conversations over overpriced lattes. I arrived early and chose a table in the back corner, away from the lunch crowd. When Evan showed up, he looked tired in a way I'd never seen before. The confident, suit-wearing brother I'd grown up envying seemed smaller somehow, less certain of his place in the world. He ordered a black coffee and sat down across from me with the weary expression of someone who'd been having difficult conversations all day. What he told me over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. According to Evan, Mom hadn't just given him money for my house. She'd been supporting him financially for over 2 years. His accounting job hadn't been going as well as he'd let everyone believe. He'd been struggling with debt, behind on his rent, and too proud to ask for help directly. Mom had been quietly bailing him out, month after month, with the understanding that he'd pay her back when his career got back on track. The $160,000 for my house had been her way of helping both of us, giving me a place to live while providing Evan with the stability he needed to get his life together. But here's the thing that really got to me. Even if his story was true, even if Mom had been helping him all along, that didn't change what she'd written in her notes. The money was supposed to buy me a house, not solve Evan's financial problems. She'd trusted him to do the right thing, and he'd chosen himself instead. Sitting across from Evan in that coffee shop, listening to him explain how our mother had been financially supporting him, while everyone thought he was a successful one, I felt like I was watching a movie where the plot twist completely reframes everything you thought you understood about the characters. He'd been living paycheck to paycheck for over 2 years, he said, ever since his accounting firm had downsized and he'd been forced to take a position with a smaller company at significantly lower pay. Too embarrassed to tell the family about his struggles, he'd started borrowing money from Mom with promises to pay it back once his situation improved. The really twisted part was that while he was taking Mom's money to cover his rent and credit card payments, he was still showing up to family gatherings talking about investment strategies and tax planning. Everyone continued to see him as a financially responsible brother, while he was basically one missed payment away from having his car repossessed. But even as Evan laid out this sob story, try and make me understand the pressure he'd been under, I couldn't shake the fundamental truth that kept echoing in my head. Mom had specifically earmarked that $160,000 for my house. She'd written it down, dated it, and trusted him to carry out her wishes. Instead, he'd used it to solve his own problems and moved into the house she'd intended for me. When I pointed this out, Evan's whole demeanor shifted. The vulnerable, struggling brother act disappeared, and I got a glimpse of the calculating person who'd been manipulating the situation from the beginning. He leaned forward and told me that Mom had been worried about giving me that much money all at once, afraid I'd make poor decisions and end up worse off than before. According to Evan, she'd asked him to buy the house in his name initially, with a plan to transfer ownership to me gradually, as I proved I could handle the responsibility. Of course, there was no written agreement about the supposed arrangement, no timeline for when the transfer would happen, and no witnesses to these alleged conversations. I asked him why. If this was true, he'd never mentioned any of it during our previous conversations. Why had he acted surprised when I showed him Mom's paperwork? Why hadn't he explained the supposed plan from the beginning, instead of letting me think he'd simply stolen my inheritance? Evan got defensive, saying he'd been hoping to avoid involving lawyers and courts in family business. He'd wanted to handle things quietly, to protect Mom's reputation, and keep private family matters from becoming public record. The lawsuit, he claimed, had forced him to reveal details he preferred to keep confidential. The conversation went on for another hour, with Evan alternating between explanations, justifications, and subtle threats about what a prolonged court battle might cost me both financially and emotionally. He painted a picture of expensive legal fees, hostile family members, and a case that could drag on for years with no guarantee of success. But something had changed in me during those months of investigation and legal preparation. Maybe it was finally seeing Mom's handwritten evidence of how much she believed in me, or maybe it was just reaching the point where I was tired of being treated like the family member whose needs came last. Either way, I wasn't buying what Evan was selling anymore. I told him that if Mom had really wanted him to hold on to the house temporarily, she would have written that down too. She was meticulous about documenting her financial decisions, as evidenced by everything I'd found in her safety deposit box. The absence of any written plan for transferring property to me was an oversight. It was proof that no such plan had existed. Evan's final offer was to let me buy the house from him at current market value, which had increased significantly since the purchase. He'd essentially be making a profit on appreciation that should have been mine, while I'd be paying full price for something Mom had already bought for me. When I declined, he shrugged like he'd expected as much and said he'd see me in court. The months leading up to the trial were emotionally exhausting. Patricia and I spent countless hours preparing, going through bank records, interviewing potential witnesses, and building a timeline that clearly showed Mom's intentions. We tracked down the real estate agent who'd helped with the house purchase, the bank officers who processed Mom's withdrawals, and even some of Mom's friends who remembered her talking about wanting to help me get established in my own place. Meanwhile, Evan's legal team was working just as hard to discredit my case. They deposed family members who testified about my supposed financial irresponsibility, brought in character witnesses who painted Evan as a devoted son who'd sacrificed his own interests to care for our aging mother, and argued that the money had been gifts rather than funds held in trust for a specific purpose. The family schism that started with phone calls and awkward conversations deepened into something that felt permanent. Holidays became exercises in careful planning to avoid being in the same room as relatives who'd chosen sides. Some cousins stopped inviting me to gatherings altogether, while others made a point of staying neutral in ways that somehow felt worse than outright hostility. The trial itself was scheduled to last 3 days, which Patricia said was typical for this type of case. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting and worn carpet that made everything feel more like a bureaucratic office than the dramatic legal arena I'd imagined from watching too many TV shows. Judge Williams had clearly done her homework, asking pointed questions that showed she understood the complexities of the case. She seemed particularly interested in the timeline of events, especially the gap between Mom's final bank withdrawal and her death, and what communication might have occurred during that period. My testimony went better than I'd hoped. Patricia had prepared me well, and I felt confident explaining how I discovered the safety deposit box and what the documents had revealed about Mom's intentions. The hardest part was keeping my emotions in check when describing how it felt to realize Mom had been planning to give me a home while I'd been convinced she saw me as a failure. Evan's testimony was polished and professional, exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd spent years in client-facing roles. He painted himself as a dutiful son who'd been trying to honor his mother's complex and sometimes contradictory wishes while dealing with his own financial struggles, and a grieving brother who'd misunderstood the situation. His lawyer did a good job of highlighting my lack of homeownership experience, my modest income, and my history of what they characterized as financial instability. They suggested that Mom might have had second thoughts about the house purchase, that her trust in Evan to handle the situation appropriately was evidence of her true wishes rather than proof of his wrongdoing. But they couldn't explain away Mom's written documentation. Her notes were clear, dated, and specific about the purpose of the money. When Patricia cross-examined Evan about why he'd never mentioned his supposed agreement with Mom during our initial confrontations, his answers became vague and defensive. The most damaging testimony came from Maria Santos, the bank manager who'd helped Mom with her financial arrangements over the years. Maria remembered Mom specifically mentioning her plans to help me buy a house, and she testified that Mom had seemed excited about the prospect of seeing me settled in my own place. Maria also confirmed that Mom had been unusually specific about the paperwork for withdrawal, asking multiple times whether the bank needed any documentation about the money's intended purpose. This wasn't the behavior of someone making a casual gift to one child with vague instructions about maybe helping another child sometime in the future. Evan's attorney tried to discredit Maria's testimony by suggesting her memory might be unreliable, but the bank's own record supported her account. The withdrawal slip included Mom's handwritten note about the house purchase, and the timing aligned perfectly with her other documented preparations. Judge Williams took 2 weeks to render her decision, which Patricia said was typical, but felt like an eternity to me. I spent those 14 days oscillating between confidence and terror, replaying key moments from the trial and trying to read meaning into the judge's expressions and questions. When we finally returned to court for the verdict, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Judge Williams spoke for nearly 20 minutes, carefully explaining her reasoning and the legal principles that applied to our situation. She found that the evidence clearly showed Mom had entrusted specific funds to Evan for a specific purpose that he had failed to fulfill. The court ordered Evan to either transfer the house to me or compensate me for its current market value, plus interest and legal fees. Judge Williams also noted that while family financial arrangements could be complicated, trust and fiduciary responsibility were serious legal concepts that couldn't be ignored simply because the parties were related. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the sense that justice actually existed and that sometimes, if you fought hard enough and had the truth on your side, things could work out the way they were supposed to. Evan chose to transfer the house rather than pay me cash, which made sense given his financial situation. The paperwork took a month, and the whole process felt surreal. I was about to own a house I'd never chosen, in a neighborhood I'd only visited as an outsider. The day I got the keys, I sat in my car for 30 minutes before going inside. Walking through those rooms as the actual owner felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life. The kitchen had good light. The bedrooms were bigger than anything I'd ever had. And there was even a small office space with computer repair business I'd been thinking about starting. The first weeks were a crash course in homeownership. The water heater made strange noises. The front door stuck when it rained. But fixing my own problems felt different than calling a landlord. I painted over Evan's beige walls, installed shelves, and even tried basic landscaping. Every improvement felt like proof I could take care of something important. The family situation remained complicated. Some relatives slowly started reaching out, maybe realizing the court decision meant I hadn't been crazy after all. Cousin Jenny called to congratulate me, though our conversation was awkward. Uncle Dave sent a card but didn't call directly, his way of acknowledging he'd been wrong without saying it. About 3 months after moving in, I was working in the garage when Evan's car pulled into my driveway. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes before getting out. He looked different, thinner, less polished than the confident professional I'd grown up envying. When I answered the door, he seemed surprised by how much I'd changed the place. New paint, different furniture, family photos in the hallway. We stood there like we were trying to remember how brothers were supposed to interact after everything that had happened. He said he'd been driving around the neighborhood, thinking how strange it was to see someone else in the house where he planned his future. Samantha had left him after the trial. He mentioned casually the financial stress and legal drama had been too much for their relationship. What followed was a conversation I'd been dreading and hoping for since our first confrontation. Not angry accusations, but something closer to honesty about what had really happened and why. Evan admitted he'd known from the beginning the money was supposed to buy me a house. There had never been any complex arrangement with Mom. No gradual transfer plan. No concerns about my readiness. He'd simply seen an opportunity to solve his problems with money meant to solve mine, convincing himself he deserved it more. The worst part, he said, wasn't the legal consequences or family drama. It was realizing Mom had trusted him to do the right thing, and he'd chosen not to. He'd spent months telling himself he was protecting the family from my supposed irresponsibility, when really he'd been protecting himself from admitting his own failures. I found myself feeling something unexpected. Not forgiveness, but sad understanding of how someone could make terrible choices while convincing themselves they were being reasonable. Evan had always been a golden child, and when that success started crumbling, he'd been too proud to ask for help honestly. But understanding his motivations didn't change what he'd done. I told him I appreciated his honesty, and maybe someday we could figure out how to be brothers again, but not today. Too much had happened for us to pretend everything was fine. As he was leaving, Evan said something that caught me off guard. Seeing what I'd done with the house, how I'd made it my own, and was building something real, made him realize Mom had been right to believe in me. He'd spent so many years thinking of me as the brother who needed taking care that he'd never noticed I was capable of taking care of myself. After he drove away, I stood in my doorway looking out at the neighborhood that was finally mine. This was the life Mom had imagined for me, the stability she'd worked to make possible. 6 months later, I was working in the front yard when Evan's car pulled up again. He looked even more worn down, moving like someone carrying a heavy weight. His apartment lease was up, he'd lost his job, and he was wondering if maybe I'd let him stay in the spare bedroom while he got back on his feet. The old me might have felt sorry for him. Might have convinced myself that helping family was always right regardless of past behavior. But standing in the yard of the house Mom had intended for me, the house I'd fought in court to claim, I felt something different. I looked at my brother and saw someone who'd spent years making choices that prioritized his comfort over other people's needs. Someone who'd taken advantage of Mom's trust, stolen my future, and divided our family rather than admit he was struggling. I told him no, not angrily, but clearly and without room for negotiation. This house was mine because Mom believed I deserved a place to build something stable. I wasn't going to risk that stability by letting someone move in who'd already proven he'd take what didn't belong to him when things got tough. Evan stood there for a long moment, and I could see him cycling through arguments he'd probably prepared during the drive over. Appeals to family loyalty, reminders of how Mom would have wanted us to support each other, subtle hints about how it would look to relatives still watching our relationship. But those arguments didn't carry the weight they once might have. I'd learned something important during the legal battles and family drama. Being related to someone doesn't obligate you to enable their poor decisions or sacrifice your well-being for their comfort. I wished him luck and went back to my yard work. After a few minutes, I heard his car start and drive away. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a beer, watching the sunset above a neighborhood that had finally become home. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Mom had seen that potential before I'd seen it myself, and now I was finally living up to the investment she'd made in my future.